Hello and welcome back for today's reading of Listen by Stephanie S. Tolan. I know it's been a while since we've read this book, so we're going to actually get to read 2 chapters today. We are on chapter 6. Let's get started. Chapter 6, The Taming. Charlie marks a big red 2 on her calendar for this day, June 11th. She intends to keep track of this process she has named the taming. She writes the words beneath June on the calendar because she hopes it will be finished by the end of the month. That'll be 19 days, very nearly 3 weeks. She plans to use food and treats to win him over. Every single one of the Eagle Lake dogs comes willingly to get a treat. Even Bo, Mrs. Jensen's black lab, who is 18 years old now and has trouble hearing. Lots of people at the lake take treats for the dogs when they go out for walks, even if they don't have a dog themselves. Wild and frightened as Coyote is, Charlie thinks he is still a dog. Dogs and people go together. By the end of the month, she wants him in her room at night instead of alone in the woods. Whatever people might have done to him before, she'll have to prove to him she's different. After breakfast, Charlie forces herself to get into Sarita's beat-up old Civic for the drive to the pet store. She still hates getting into cars, hates knowing what awful things can happen in a car on any ordinary day on any ordinary road. The store is a huge place with whole aisles full of jewel-studded collars and stuffed squeaky toys and even boots and hats and matching jackets. A sign at the front of the store says, "The place for pets and their parents." Parents. So stupid. This is why Charlie doesn't want Coyote to be a pet. Before Paul Morgan left for work, he gave Sarita the rules for this shopping trip, and she walks beside the shopping buggy that Charlie is using like a walker, nodding or shaking her head as Charlie finds things to put in it. Dry food only, she says when Charlie stops by the brand of canned food Mrs. Davis gives Sadie. Your father says if the dog is starving, he'll appreciate anything he gets, and there's no need to spend a fortune. Charlie sighs and moves on toward the aisle with the dry food. She tries to tell from Sarita's expression what she thinks of giving Coyote only dry food, but Sarita's face could be a mahogany mask. It was still and steady. The word mahogany in that sentence is a type of wood. She knows the woman must have opinions of her own. She's too tough not to. But most of the time, it's impossible to know what they are. When Sarita doesn't agree with one of Paul Morgan's orders, her mouth might twitch a little, and something might flash in her eyes. But nothing more. She's exactly the kind of live-in housekeeper / babysitter any father would want when he is suddenly left to raise a daughter on his own. He writes her paycheck, and she does and says whatever he wants her to. Charlie pulls a 10-pound bag of food off of a shelf. Sarita hasn't said what she's thinking about the taming. Charlie doesn't even know if Sarita likes dogs. Charlie chooses 2 heavy dishes, one for food and one for water, and a bag of little colored bone-shaped dog biscuits for treats. She isn't sure what size collar to get, so she finds a heavyweight nylon one that can be adjusted, and a nylon leash to go with it. She doesn't expect to use the leash a lot. After all, Coyote will still live at Eagle Lake, where nearly every dog runs free. She chooses green for collar and leash. Green, she thinks, will look good against Coyote's red gold coat. Don't forget the training books, Sarita tells her when she has everything else in the buggy. Your father expects you to do this right. Choosing books takes the longest. There are plenty to choose from, but none of them seems to have what Charlie needs. They're about training, not taming. Finally, she picks 2, but she doesn't expect them to be much use. It is afternoon now, and Charlie is on the woods trail on her way to get Sadie and Coyote. She's wearing jeans to keep the poison ivy off and hiking boots to keep her from twisting her ankle and wrenching her knee on the uneven ground. The boots aren't working, and it is very much too hot for jeans. It would be better to walk earlier in the day before it gets this hot, but the training book says dogs need routine. Her leg isn't handling the walk today any better than it did yesterday. It isn't just the heat and pain that make the walk miserable this time, though. She must be the first person to come this way today. She keeps walking into lines of spider webs strung across the trail. They are invisible until the sticky filaments are all over her bare arms, or worse, all over her face. She keeps having to wipe them off her cheeks, her forehead, her hair. Sometimes there's spiders too. Tiny black and white spiky triangular spiders that drop onto her shoulder and run down her arms. She's just thinking it might be better to walk the long way around on the road. It's too wide for spider webs. When she remembers that since she has to walk the dogs on the woods trail, if she doesn't smack into the webs on the way over, she'll just smack into them on the way back. Spider stick. It is in her mother's voice in her head again. Of course, her mother used spider sticks to catch webs on the trail. She showed Charlie a bush called Russian olive, with brittle, easy-to-break branches. Her mother would hold one of the in front of her as she walked, and the webs would get tangled in the leafy branches, spiders and all. A moment later, Charlie is walking the trail, safe from webs, peering through the silvery-backed leaves of a spider stick. She pushes away the memory of walking the trail with her mother and focuses on Coyote. Where is he now? She fills her mind with the image she had of him last night under the tree. He comes and goes, Mrs. Davis said when Charlie called to get permission to keep walking Sadie around the lake every day. The image feels real. It is so clear. He is there, she thinks. He is. She's wearing a waist pack with supplies for the taming. Dog biscuits and a small makeup mirror. Charlie is proud of coming up with this idea. The mirror will let her watch him behind her without turning and scaring him off. As much as her leg is hurting by the time she gets to the hill on the other side of Hawk Pond, she has only had to rest twice this time. She stops among the kudzu vines halfway up the hill, puts her little fingers in her mouth, like this, and whistles. Excuse me. And whistles loud and sharp, the way her father taught her. She wants Coyote to associate the whistle with her, and her with food. When she gets to the top of the hill and drops the spider stick at the side of the trail, Sadie is trotting toward her on the road. Together, Sadie frisking alongside, they head for the Davises' yard. Coyote is where she imagined him, ears pricked towards her. There's something incredibly alert in the way he sits, as if every cell in his body is aware of her, watching her. Hi, Coyote, she calls to him. He doesn't so much as twitch an ear, but he has heard her. He understands about his name, she thinks, has understood since we first thought it at him. Since she first thought it at him. She takes a biscuit out of her waist pack. I brought you something. Before she has a chance to hold the biscuit out for Coyote to see, Sadie has jumped up and snatched it out of her hand. No, 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 she yells. But Sadie has already swallowed the biscuit and is bouncing around her, yelping and sniffing at the waist pack, begging for another. Charlie digs another biscuit out of the pack and throws it as far down the road as she can. Daisy dashes off to get it, and Charlie turns quickly to offer the wild dog another. He isn't there. His place by the tree is empty, just a patch of smooth red dirt in the midst of the leaf litter and honeysuckle. Sadie is back already, begging for another biscuit. So much for the idea of luring Coyote around the lake with biscuits, Charlie thinks. She'll just have to count on following Sadie. Come on, dogs, she calls. Let's go for a walk. At the sound of the word, Sadie rushes ahead towards the beginning of the trail, the brush of her tail waving. Charlie follows, willing Coyote to come along. At the bottom of the hill, she looks back to see if he is following, and barely catches a glimpse of him as he scoots off the trail. She's forgotten about the mirror. When she is through the poison ivy and nearly to the spillway, she pulls out the mirror and holds it up to her left eye. Coyote, ears and tail up, is trotting down the middle of the trail. Let's take a quick break, you guys. That was the end of chapter 6. It's good to get up and move a little bit, maybe get some water, and come back after you're done. Pause the video, do some of that, get a quick break in, and then come back when you're ready. Okay, let's continue reading with chapter 7, titled 1 Week. It has been a week. Charlie, at the dining room window, chews her lip and scratches the poison ivy rash on the inside of her elbow as she watches Coyote sneak up to the bowl of food at the end of the driveway. He still refuses to eat unless she is all the way inside the house with the door closed. A whole week she's been feeding him, and there's been no change at all. No, she thinks. There's been a change, all right. In the wrong dog. Sadie doesn't go home anymore as soon as they get to Charlie's house. Charlie can't put Coyote's food out while Sadie's there, or Sadie will eat it, so she has to tie her to the railing by the side door until Coyote is finished. The first time she tied her, Charlie took Sadie a couple of biscuits after she put Coyote's food out for him, so Sadie wouldn't feel left out. The dog books are right about patterns and routine. Sadie expects the tying now, and the biscuits. Every day when Coyote has eaten, Charlie unties Sadie, and Sadie hangs out for a while before she goes home, hoping, Charlie thinks, for more biscuits. Coyote, still standing as far from the food bowl as he can, stretches his head down and snatches a few mouthfuls before backing away and checking for danger. It's almost as if he's two different creatures. The regular dog that trots along the trail or frolics with Sadie, and the wild one, the wary and terrified one Charlie is watching now. He looks exactly the way he did the very first day. His tail is down, his ears are back, every muscle in his body tense and ready to run. She doesn't understand why he is so frightened. It can't be just that he's wild. Wild animals come to food. When they used to have bird feeders, the birds came right away to get the seed, and squirrels. They used to raid the feeders and wouldn't back off, even if you pounded on the windows. Her mother would. Charlie stops the thought and pushes the memory away. The point is that. Sorry about that, guys. Got a phone call. Back to it. Charlie stops the thought and pushes her memory away. The point is that even with a person a few feet away stomping and yelling at them, squirrels, fully wild creatures, are more interested in food than afraid of people. For Coyote, it is different. Why? What could his life have been like before he came to Eagle Lake? Without Charlie intending it, an image forms in her mind. A man is putting food at the edge of a mowed yard where the woods begin. She closes her eyes and gives herself over to the images, like watching a movie in her mind. Setting the bowl down, the man slips behind a bush a few feet away. There is a car parked on a gravel drive nearby. Another man is crouched behind the car, waiting. Coyote, nose up, materializes out of the woods. As he approaches the food, the men pounce. He is picked up and carried, struggling, to a small shed and locked inside. Charlie shivers and opens her eyes. This really happened, she thinks. She feels it the way she felt the dog's terror as he struggled to get free of the men holding him. No wonder Coyote's so wary of being fed. All this time she's been counting on food to win him over. The books say that dogs bond readily to the person who feeds them. Feeding Coyote is supposed to show him that she's a friend, someone he can trust. But it's doing the opposite. Putting that bowl out every day only proves to him that she's dangerous, a threat. Like the animal control people Mrs. Davis called. No wonder the can of tuna they said would lure any dog into the trap didn't work. Coyote understands about food and humans. Food and traps. So I'm going to pause for a second and remind you guys of the lesson that I put on Seesaw, I think 2 weeks ago, about taking perspectives. What we're seeing here is Charlie try to understand Coyote's perspective and why he acts the way he does by considering the experiences he might have had in the past that make him act the way that he is now. And that reminds me of the activity that you did afterwards, where you thought about why the characters in The Three Bears acted the way they did. And we learned a little bit about past experiences and values and beliefs and how those things change the way we act. Remember, it's important to be mindful of the things that cause us to be the way we are. If you're in a conflict with a friend or a family member, remember that they might be making those choices or acting the way they are for a reason. And it's important to remember that. Let's keep reading. Charlie pulls a chair away from the dining room table and sits down by the window. There's nothing in the dog training books that will help her solve this problem. Nothing about working with a wild and terrified dog you can't touch or even get close to. A dog you can't collar or cage or corral. She feels like crying. She'll have to rethink her whole plan. Plan! As if she really had one. All there was to it was the idea that walking him around the lake and feeding him every day would get him to trust her. The taming was supposed to happen all by itself. Food, good. Charlie gives food. Charlie, good. Like that. Everyone at Eagle Lake knows now that what Charlie is trying to do. Mrs. Jensen, the retired librarian who used to babysit her when she was little, is the editor of Tail Feathers, the newsletter that went into everybody's boxes over the weekend. She wrote a story about Charlie and Coyote and asked anyone who might have been feeding him to stop, so that Charlie would be the only one he could go to for food. Yesterday, when Charlie got around the Davises' house, Mrs. Davis and Sadie were out on the road with Mr. and Mrs. Sutcliffe and their Labrador retriever, Boone, and Mrs. Hobbs with her little white dog, Pandy. They'd all told her what a good thing she was doing. All the time they were standing in the road talking, the dogs, including Coyote, had played in the Davises' yard. But when the Sutcliffes and Mrs. Hobbs went on with their walk and Mrs. Davis went inside, Coyote disappeared into the woods. What, besides food, does she have to offer this dog? A place to live, but he has that. It isn't very comfortable, just a bare spot under a tree. If he were really wild, a fox or a coyote, he wouldn't have any more than that. A den, maybe? Coyote could probably dig himself a den if he wanted to, if he needed one. She can offer him companionship, but he has Sadie and the other dogs. Why would he want companionship with a human? Mrs. Hobbs told her yesterday that Coyote used to follow anyone who would walk a dog around the lake, staying mostly out of sight in the woods, but still following. It wasn't just the other dogs he was following. He wants a family. You can see it in his eyes. Charlie wondered if that could be true. She thinks of the connection she feels with him the first time she saw him. It wasn't just from her to him. It was from him to her, too. He does want a family. He's just too afraid to know how to make it happen. She looks out at him now, finishing the last of the food, backing away towards the woods. He needs me, she thinks. Coyotes and foxes and wolves know how to live in the wild. Dogs don't. What about winter? Every year on really cold nights, they tell people on the evening news to bring their dogs inside, or make sure they have a warm, insulated shelter to go to. Coyote won't have that. He needs me. He does. She has to come up with a way to make herself more to him than the person who puts food out for him. Stop that scratching. Sarita has left her jigsaw puzzle and come into the living room. Don't you know the hot water trick? Charlie hasn't realized she is scratching her arm again. What trick? Run water as hot as you can stand it on the rash until it doesn't itch anymore. That'll stop the itching all day. 8 hours anyway. Do it again before you go to bed, and it won't itch in the night either. Stupid old wives' tale, Charlie thinks. If that worked, why wouldn't everybody know to do it? How do you know? Sarita's eyes flash. Because I know everything. Yeah, right. You can do it, or you can go on itching. It's up to you. Charlie decides to try it. Sarita follows her into the kitchen. So, she says, not much change in that wild dog. Charlie tests the water to see how hot it is, then puts her arm under the faucet. How long do I have to do this? Like I said, till it stops itching. People caught him with food before, Charlie says. She doesn't mention how she knows this. Feeding scares him. I need to do something that'll give him a reason to like me. If you know everything, tell me what to do. What do other dogs like people for? Charlie realizes the poison ivy really has stopped itching. She turns off the water. Playing, I guess. Fetch? Catch? But he isn't a regular dog. He doesn't do that stuff. Sadie does, Sarita says. When Charlie goes to untie Sadie, Sadie frisks around her, front paws splayed, head down, her back end in the air, tail wagging. She is begging Charlie to play. Sarita is certainly right about Sadie. Charlie leans down to get a dead branch that has fallen off one of the trees by the carport. As soon as she picks it up, Sadie leaps for it, trying to snatch it away. Down, Charlie says, holding it as high in the air as she can. She throws the stick up the slope of the driveway towards where Coyote is watching from the safety of the trees. Go get it, Sadie. The dog doesn't need words. Of course not, Charlie thinks, watching her tear off after the stick. Golden retriever? Charlie calls to Sadie to bring back the stick. She isn't as good at letting go as she is at retrieving, but Charlie manages to get it away from her and throw it again. Ears flying, Sadie runs after the stick, and Charlie moves up the driveway, keeping an eye on Coyote, who is sitting in a tangle of honeysuckle on the other side of the road. This is what dogs and people do together, she thinks at him. Sadie drops the stick and backs away from it, wagging. Charlie picks it up, and Sadie begins to bark, urging her to throw it. Coyote is standing now, ears and tail up, following every movement. His tail begins to wag. When Charlie throws the stick, Sadie gets it, and Coyote comes out of the woods to join the game, chasing Sadie. After a few minutes, Sadie drops the stick, and the game becomes their usual chase and grab. So focused is Coyote that he doesn't notice when Charlie moves into the middle of the yard, so that the dogs have to swerve around her as they run, the way they swerve around the azaleas. At last, Sadie, tongue hanging out, flops onto the grass a few feet from where Charlie is standing. Coyote circles, barking a high-pitched bark, snapping at Sadie's ears, her feet, urging her to get up again. When Sadie doesn't respond, he gives up and sinks to the ground next to her. It's the closest Charlie has ever been to him. Over Sadie's shoulder, Coyote looks directly at Charlie. His tongue, too, hangs out as he pants. There are big splotches of blue on his long, pink tongue. Charlie has never seen anything like it. Blue spots on his tongue, Sarita says later. That's chow. Mama or daddy or grandma, maybe. That dog's got chow in him somewhere. She is leaning over her jigsaw puzzle, squinting at a piece in her hand. So, Charlie says, what does that mean? It means you don't tell your father yet. Chows have a bad rep in the dog world. Blue tongue's likely to scare Paul Morgan off. End you up with some little beagle pup, some chihuahua. What's the bad rep? Sarita makes a little satisfied huh as she puts the puzzle piece into place. Aggressive, protective. One-man dogs, they say. One family, anyway. Coyote's not aggressive, not even with dogs, and he doesn't have a family. Sarita shrugs and takes another piece from a cookie sheet full of bits of sky. Not now anyway. You itching, by the way? Charlie looks at the rash on her arm, surprised. No. Don't mess with me, girl. Charlie sees a cloud piece and the place in the puzzle where it fits and puts it in. You go rest that leg, Sarita says, slapping at Charlie's hand. You've been outside too long today. Sarita is right, Charlie realizes when she settles into the recliner. Her leg, her whole body, has been getting stronger this week, the walk leaving her with more energy and less pain. But after nearly 2 hours with the dog, throwing a stick for Sadie sometimes, or just sitting on the fender of Sarita's car in the shade of the carport watching him, she is worn out. When Sadie finally swam home, her tail wagging as she went, throwing drops of water that glittered in the sun, Coyote followed her to the water line and stood with his front teeth in the water, whining. Or front feet, not front teeth. Come back, he seemed to be calling to her. It was as if a huge bungee cord stretched between the two dogs, pulling harder and harder as Sadie swam away. When she reached the other side and pulled herself out of the water next to the Davises' dock, Coyote gave one last, exasperated whine and launched himself into the water, swimming with his ears back, his tail completely underwater. The contrast between the ways Sadie swam, splashing and wagging, and Coyote's grim determination made Charlie laugh. This was clearly a dog who hated to swim. When he got to the other side, he dragged himself out of the water exactly where Sadie had, shook himself off, and followed her up into the trees. Charlie flips the lever on the recliner and leans back. Her legs stretch out in front of her. She needs to break the bungee cord that links the dogs, she thinks, as she picks up the remote and turns on the television. Better yet, she needs to find a way to transfer the bungee from Sadie to herself. That was the end of chapter 7. See you next time for chapter 8. Thanks for joining me, guys. Bye!